In this episode of King Philip's War, we're going to take a look at the native people of New England. A little bit of history. We can't go into all the tribes and all the confederations and all the things that happened, but we want to set the stage for what's coming. New England stream in March. In 1675, March was a time of renewal for both colonist and native people. March was a time when the English planting year began. For the Indians, or native people, March was a time of sugaring. Tribes coming back together again after the long winter hunt. A time to celebrate. The death of winter is being replaced by the life of spring. This is a time when you repair your fish wares so that when the shad, salmon, alewives, herring, stripers, and even eels come back up the river systems from the ocean to spawn, or if you're a striper, to try to eat the fish that are spawning. Native people using fish wares would catch their bounty during this time. For native people, fishing was a critical part of their year. It was a time when they could gain as much as a third of the calories they were going to get throughout the growing season, and of course recover from the starving times of late winter. Fish traps and fish wares were generally the operational style of native fishermen. The native people would use the walls of the fish ware that they had built as wharfs from which to net, spear, or club the fish as they went up the river. They could hide behind the wings of the V to get out of the main current and rest, which is what fish that migrate up rivers do if you've ever watched them. After they've spawned, they come back down the river, and the central part of the V is where the main current is. And so that's where they'd place their fish traps, made of wicker baskets almost, facing upstream. Fish swim in, and the native people have a basket full of whatever they were catching. According to English sources, native fishermen did very well with this practice. After the fishing season came to its conclusion, the native people would be involved in farming, and that was typically the work of the tribe's women, who had been charged with the responsibility of storing the seeds for the crops that they'd be planting. When the planting began in June, so did the tending. And when Europeans arrived on the scene and lived side by side with native people, they immediately thought that the native men were absolutely lazy, did very little work, pawned everything off on the women, who they saw working in the fields and often working in what they considered to be backbreaking ways, including often building the stockades that would surround the villages. The men were expected to be the hunters, the fishermen, and the warriors. As the growing season progressed from the early burying through the harvesting of beans, and then squash, and then maize, and finally pumpkins, tobacco is often overlooked. We talk about the three sisters, but to the native people, the most important of all crops was tobacco, which they believed provided them with security and safety in a world filled with spirits, purifying their words and protecting them. We should always include tobacco as one of the major agricultural crops of the eastern woodland Indian. Now, if we take a look at their agricultural practices, they began foraging in the early spring, looking for ramps, looking for other wild edibles, tubers, deer truffles, things like that. And as we move into the berrying season, of course, you could imagine they'd be going after the wild strawberries, which grow about as big as your pinky nail then. Finally, the native women would have the planting field cleared and hoed, mounds made and prepared. Some of the native people used fish caught in the spring runs as fertilizer. Again, not all, some. We have evidence of it being done, especially in the area near Cape Cod, where the soils were fairly infertile. Along the Connecticut River, in that rich, dark Hadley loam that it's famous for, this was unnecessary. But the native women would be out planting, and the men, at this time, would be typically preparing for war after the fishing was done. The morning war was a practice that was done during the months of May and June. And it's interesting to consider First Nations warfare was ritualized, and the Europeans looked at it as a kind of blood feuding. It was a little bit more than that, and it usually involved the capture and adoption of natives from, quote, enemy tribes to replace the souls of the dead. That was the typical occupation of the native men in the month of June. July, August, September, we're going to see the native crops at their finest. And by the time the last pumpkins are harvested, I use the term pumpkin. That's a Western Massachusetts thing. How do you say pumpkin? Anyways, as the last pumpkins are harvested, the native tribes are preparing to move into what they call the winter hunt mode, or the long hunt. And the long hunt involved a portion of the tribe staying in the communal village, while the rest of the tribe broke into small hunting groups and went out into the mountains and hills of the region, which is not typically where they had their summer villages. Again, the soil's not as good, the growing season's not as long. We think of native people, when we're up on mountains and going on hikes, think about the trails, the Appalachian Trail and the Metacomet Trail in New England, and you always think, oh, the native people. No. If you ever want to get from point A to point B at this time, and today, if you're going to do it on foot, you're going to follow water courses. Trails existed linking water courses, but most of the travel was done along rivers, not along ridges. So kind of get that early 20th century mess out of your mind. If you've ever walked across mountaintops, you know that they go up and down and around and up, and there's gorges. It just doesn't make sense. They're not out leaf peeping. They're not out on the hikes that you and I go on. In October, the native people would begin to prepare for the long hunt, which involved several hunting parties, depending on the size of the village, with one group, usually the elderly and the youngest. They would stay in the village with a few excellent hunters and some stored food, while the other groups would head out, sometimes miles and miles away, and build a wigwam and there survive the winter. Those of you that don't hunt don't understand that if the entire tribe tried hunting around their village, the scent of the tribal people would quickly skunk the game, and there'd be nothing, and everyone would go hungry. If they pursued the organizational style of hunting that I've described, the tribe would maximize its chance of survival during the long winter. And New England winters in these times could be very long, starting with the first snows in October and extending all the way, sometimes into April. The first animals to be hunted would typically be deer, which would be going into the rut during the month of October and early November. And after that, they'd begin pursuing beaver when you get the first freeze, and native people loved beaver tail and beaver meat. And they would pursue fur-bearing animals for the use of their fur, the way we would, to make warm hats and clothing, mittens. By late December and January, they'd be looking for black bear that have gone into hibernation. In those days, bear were famous for hibernating in hollow trees, and our forests are certainly recovering from the 3 times they've been logged since contact, but we really have very few of those massive old sage trees that black bear hibernated in. You got to imagine how big a tree has got to be for a bear to hibernate. And we have documentation of native people climbing trees with burning birch bark and dropping that birch bark into the cavity of the tree, driving out the bear so that they could shoot it with arrows or firearms. Kind of an interesting technique. Native people didn't have domesticated animals other than dogs. Dogs were basically used as alarm clocks by the native people. In addition to acting as pets like they do for us, they also provided food sources for many tribes, but not all. Now, what we've been talking about so far is the lifeways of native people across the seasons, but those lifeways are going to change rapidly with the coming of the Euros. When studying the native people of New England, we should remember that New England is basically a shatter belt, which is an area of difficult geography. Lots of peninsulas, very swampy, mixed with islands. These are areas where smaller cultures can survive when confronted by larger ones. And the tribal people of New England were extremely different. Tribal people that lived along the coast didn't have to do the long hunt as much as the tribal people who lived inland, because they had access to shells and sea creatures that they could harvest if the season became difficult. Meanwhile, if they lived inland, the long hunt was a definite thing that they participated in. Nipmuc, Wabanaki, Mohican, people of the river tribes, these people all would have participated in the long hunt. Long usually meaning 4 or 5 months. But these practices would change quickly with the coming of the European, because the European brings with them stored food. The native people didn't often store food, at least not in bulk. They kept seeds for planting, and they were able to salt away enough food for the elderly and the young during the long hunt as they stayed in the village. Native tribal people all practiced eat-all ceremonies, where they would basically devour all the corn, all the squash, all the beans, all the fish, all of a bear, all of the deer that had been, because preserving food was so difficult in their world. Now, again, we're not talking about all of them. Some of them had techniques, but as a whole, native people practiced eat-alls to thank the spirits, but also to absorb the calories, and that would allow them as much maximization from the moment of the season as they could possibly glean. With the coming of the European, we start seeing something known as cross-cultural exchange all across New England. Now, because of New England's geography, this had started 100 years before the Pilgrims landed. So the tribes had definitely changed. And it could have changed even earlier than that with the advent of the Viking exploration of the region. I mean, really, if you study your arrowheads, your points, you probably know that it doesn't look like the native people of the New World had bow and arrow technology until around 700 years ago. Was it contact with the Viking, or was it an independent discovery? Who knows? So, when the European arrived, there's immediate cross-cultural exchange. The Europeans bring weapons and iron that can be used in cooking pots, and boiling sugar is going to be a lot easier in an iron cooking kettle than it is going to be in a bark one. So pragmatically, and the native people were very pragmatic, adopting European practices made sense. If you take a look in the area that I live, the Agawam tribe had asked the English to move across the river after living next to them for only a year because of the English livestock depredations. Only 2 years later, the Agawams went across the river and built a stockade overlooking Pension's new settlement. Why? Because they wanted easy access to the technologies and food that the English stored. Now, this is symbiotic. There were years when English planting techniques failed miserably and they had to trade with the native people. But in general, the English livestock and the English planting methods produced more food than the native tribal methods did. So, as time went on, we see the lifeways of the native people changing drastically. Another thing that changes drastically with the coming of the European would be the religion of the native people. Native people are pantheist animist, which means that they have a pantheon of great gods. In New England, 37 of them. And at the same time, they believe that all things have spirits, and these spirits can interface with people in the real world, so that if you're not careful, you can run afoul of these spirits. Interceding between the spirit world and the real world would be the shaman, who the native people in New England called powwows. The Europeans mocked the powwows, who dressed outrageously and painted themselves and screamed and shrieked. Powwows were used as doctors. Powwows were used as counselors. Powwows were used for almost anything you can imagine, just the way English ministers and Catholic priests were used on the other side of the ocean. But as time went on, there are stories of English ministers who interceded between the powwow and their tribal people to try to disprove what the powwow were doing. That'll be an entire episode that we'll do where we're going to talk about praying Indians of the Northeast at the time of King Philip's War. But it's been nice to have you along for this ride where we've taken a look at the way the native people live across the seasons and the effects on that of European contact. In our next episode, we're going to look at the tribal peoples as they stand in 1675 at the time of the war. So, hope you'll join me for that one. Like, subscribe, share, and all that good stuff.